COVID birth. We have a very large sample study of women who were giving birth in the United States during the first year of the COVID pandemic, and information about their COVID status and whether they were admitted to the ICU at the time they were giving birth. So we can use the data to create a model for those two outcomes in the sample space of all women giving birth in the US during that time. The information we have here is a two-way table of observed counts. So that, for example, the first value in the table, 977, tells us that there were 977 pregnant women who, at the time they were giving birth, had a COVID diagnosis and were admitted to the ICU. So we can use those counts to calculate probabilities for this sample space. For instance, we can ask what proportion of women in the sample space were admitted to the ICU. So that means here, regardless of COVID status, so it's a marginal proportion or marginal probability, just probability of ICU. And this is going to be computed by calculating the total number of women admitted to the ICU. So 977 plus 7,943, that's 8,920. And dividing that by the table total, so it's 69,079. And that gives us 0.01 or 1%. So 1% of the women given birth in the first year of the pandemic were admitted to the ICU, regardless of COVID status. We can also ask what proportion of women in the sample space had a COVID diagnosis. There were 18,715 of them out of all the women, the 869,079. And so that gives us 0.022, so 2.2%. That's a marginal probability. It's just P of COVID. We also ask to obtain the probability that a woman with a COVID diagnosis was admitted to the ICU. All right, so we notice here that two things are mentioned: COVID diagnosis, admitted to the ICU. So you might want to slow down and think, is this a joint probability or is this a conditional probability? Does the probability refer to all pregnant women or just a subset of them? And you notice it says here the probability that a woman with a COVID diagnosis. So if the woman didn't have a COVID diagnosis, then that probability would not apply to her. So that means here we have a conditional probability, and the condition is that we are only at this point interested in women who had a COVID diagnosis at the time of birth. So that's our condition. And in terms of calculation, that means that we're only going to be looking at the data from the column that says gave birth with COVID-19. And what we want to know is what is the probability that she was admitted to the ICU. So within the column with COVID-19, out of the total 18,715, how many were admitted to the ICU? 977. And so 977 out of 18,715, that's 0.052, so 5.2%. You can also think about that in terms of probability equations, right? The conditional probability of ICU given COVID will be equal to the probability of ICU and COVID divided by the probability of COVID. So in the numerator, ICU and COVID, that would be the 977 out of the table total. In the denominator, that would be the column total for COVID, so the 18,715, again, divided by the table total. As you can see, the two table totals simplify, and we're left with 977 out of 18,715. We're also asked to obtain the probability that the woman admitted to the ICU had a COVID diagnosis. And here again, we have those outcomes, ICU and COVID. But this time, the probability we're looking for would only apply to a woman admitted to the ICU, which means that we are only going to be interested in those women, and so the data from the top row admitted to the ICU. And within that top row, what we want to know is what is the probability that such a woman would have had a COVID diagnosis. So that would be the 977 divided by the total for that row, 8,920. That's 0.11, so about 11%. This is the conditional probability of COVID given ICU. So now, most importantly, what do we learn from this study? And in this case, we really would like to know who had the highest probability of being admitted to the ICU, a pregnant woman with a COVID diagnosis or a pregnant woman without a COVID diagnosis. And so you can see that we're interested in the condition given that the woman had COVID versus given that the woman did not have COVID. So we've already calculated the probability of being admitted to the ICU if the woman had COVID, and we said that's 5.2%. So now we'll want to calculate the other conditional probability of being admitted to the ICU, but specifically if the woman does not have COVID. So in that case, out of the 850,364 women who gave birth without COVID, how many of them ended up in the ICU? 7,943. And so that gives us 0.09, so 0.9%, just short of 1%. So that means that women giving birth during the first year of the pandemic were much more likely to be admitted to the ICU if they had a COVID diagnosis than if they didn't. The specific supporting evidence you would want to cite here are those 5.2% versus 0.9%. Now, a question about reasoning. When we look at those admissions to the ICU, they are overwhelmingly women who did not have COVID. What we found earlier was that among the women admitted to the ICU, 11% had COVID, meaning the remaining 89% did not have COVID. Should we then conclude that women giving birth without COVID have a higher risk of needing to be admitted to the ICU than women with COVID? Well, no. And this is very important because this is a very, very common mistake. Oftentimes during the pandemic, especially at the beginning, we had reporters saying, oh, what percent of people in the ICU have COVID? This is not relevant because the question is, in general, what percent of people have COVID? And thankfully, that's always been like a minority anyway. Overall, in the entire study, regardless of ICU admission, there were way, way, way more women without COVID than women with COVID. And so the fact that the ICU also had way more women without COVID than with COVID, that doesn't tell us anything in and of itself. So it's really important to understand the relevant information here is what was the probability of being admitted to the ICU if the woman had versus if the woman did not have a COVID diagnosis. And that's where we found that the women were much more likely to be admitted to the ICU if they had a COVID diagnosis than if they didn't. So it's a higher risk for women with COVID.